You'll stand here like this photo. But these photos were taken by a guy by the name of Timothy O'Sullivan, who came down here a couple weeks after the second battle, in January 1865. And he came down and he photographed the entire inside and outside of the fort, every inch of it. Now, why did he do that? Well, he did that because at the time of the battle, this was considered to be one of the largest earthen forts in the entire world, at 1.5 miles in length. It extended all the way from where you're sitting here to where the aquarium is today. Now, does everybody know where the aquarium is? Pretty much. Okay, so it's absolutely gigantic. You know where the aquarium is? Okay. So it's absolutely gigantic, considered an engineering marvel and a construction marvel. They built this thing in about 3 years with wheelbarrows and shovels, if you can imagine that. So pretty remarkable. Now, if any of y'all are into photos, we actually have a book in the gift shop that has the entire collection of the O'Sullivan photos. One of which, that's what I just showed you, one of which shows Timothy O'Sullivan, the photographer himself, looking out over the battlefield. Now, y'all heard of Gettysburg, right? If you've ever seen photos taken after the Battle of Gettysburg, you often see a guy with his back to the camera, his arms folded, leaning on a fence, looking out over the battlefield. So Timothy O'Sullivan, the photographer, that was his trademark or his thing when he took his battlefield photos. Now, why do I find that so interesting today? It's because today you got people taking pictures of themselves all the time. What do you call it? And everybody thinks that's a new thing. You didn't want to be the one to say it, did you? And everybody thinks that's a new thing. But I think that it's very interesting that this guy was doing that 150 years ago. So it's not such a new thing. Now, another thing about the photos we got here, you may not have noticed, is if you look at this photo, you see a crater, which is hard to make out because there were limitations in 1865 photography. But this crater is about 25 feet deep, 20 feet deep. What was there at the time of the battle was an ammo depot, so it would have been a wood building. Now, remarkably, despite 40,000 shells being fired at the fort over the 2 battles, the ammo depot was not damaged as a result of the actual attacks. However, 2 days after this second attack, when the Union had won the day and occupied the fort, a couple of Union soldiers had been drinking or something, and decided to wander in there with either candles or lanterns. It exploded, killing another 138 Union soldiers and wounding over 200. So even after the battle was over, there was still a lot of carnage to be had here in the fort. Now, when you go, or what you see all over here is bits and pieces of shells. Now, when you go to most museums, you look behind the glass and you get to see different parts of the shells and whatnot. But I think what we have here is a couple pieces to pass around, because I think you'll be a little surprised at the weight of this. I think it'll be a little heavier than you anticipate. And when you hear about all the horrific injuries and whatnot that people have in the Civil War, I think this will help you understand how that can occur. Because this stuff will be flying through the air, just hitting people. I guess you can pass it up here. And so it's do you all agree that it's a little heavier than you would have anticipated? Yep. And it's just a little piece of it. A little piece of a 32-pounder. Yep. So you would not want to get hit by that. Now, the other interesting thing, when you're trying to figure out what these guys was going through their minds at the time of the battle, you'll notice now these traverses here are on the sea face. Okay? So out here is the Atlantic Ocean. This traverses here was right next to the river. The land face traverses were built higher so that the cannons could fire down on the attacking troops. The ones on the sea face were at ground level, because the way they would fire on the blockading ships was they would try to skim the cannonballs off the top of the water, kind of like you're throwing a rock in a pond. So what you'll also notice, though, about this photo, all of these were taken from inside the fort. They've turned the guns back to the inside of the fort, which means that when the Union Army attacked, the Confederate gunners on the sea face actually made the decision to fire on their own men that were involved in hand-to-hand combat with the Union Army, because they had to decide what was going to be worse, not firing on them or firing on their own men. So you really think about that going through their minds, and makes you really, feel for them and trying to have to make that kind of decision. Well, let me go ahead and get this going. It's only 10 minutes, gives you good overview.
With the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861, the agricultural South soon realized the importance of foreign trade in fighting a war. This fact became even more evident as the Union naval blockade tightened its grip on the southern coastline. In an effort to counter the blockade, the South relied heavily on speedy, light draft steamers called blockade runners for trading with the outside world. But as the war progressed, every significant Confederate port was either captured or effectively closed by the Union blockade, with the exception of Wilmington, North Carolina. Having rail connections with Virginia, Wilmington became the major supplier for General Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. The location of Wilmington, 28 miles from the mouth of the Cape Fear River, offered the port city excellent protection. But more importantly, the Cape Fear had two entrance channels, New Inlet and Old Inlet, which were separated by Smith's Island, now Bald Head Island, and Frying Pan Shoals. Although the two channels were only 5 miles apart, the Federal blockaders had the difficult job of trying to cover a 50-mile arc. The buildup of defenses at the mouth of the river made the Federal task even more difficult as the Confederates ran the blockade with increasing success. Of vital importance to the defense of the Cape Fear River was Federal Point, the narrow peninsula forming the river's lower east bank. This peninsula was the site of the construction of a series of sand batteries during the first year of the war. One of the batteries was a four-sided earthwork located on the ocean. It was named Fort Fisher in honor of Colonel Charles Fisher of North Carolina, who died in the First Battle of Manassas. The other defenses included Shepherd's Battery on the Cape Fear River and batteries Meade, Cumberland, Hedrick, and Bowles on the ocean front. Together, these fortifications mounted only 17 guns. When Colonel William Lamb assumed command of the Federal Point defenses in July of 1862, he believed that a few shots from a Union warship were capable of wiping out the entire fortifications. So, Lamb immediately set out to build a fortress that could withstand the heaviest fire of the Union Navy. His plans called for elevated batteries protected by heavy earthworks. Lamb's ideas were greatly influenced by the famous Malakoff Tower, which protected the Russian Black Sea port at Sebastopol during the Crimean War. In the 1850s, the Malakoff Tower was hailed as the strongest fortification in the world. After his plans for the new Fort Fisher were approved, Lamb began construction in the summer of 1862. Work continued on the fort until the opening shots of the first bombardment, December 24, 1864. But even then, the project was far from completed. In November 1862, Brigadier General William H.C. Whiting became commander of the Cape Fear District. Whiting supported the defensive buildup on Federal Point, and he worked hard to improve all of the lower Cape Fear fortifications. Large merchant ships with cargoes destined for the Confederacy would often unload their goods in such places as the Bahamas, Bermuda, and Nova Scotia. The goods were then loaded onto blockade runners for the remainder of the voyage. Because the channel leading to New Inlet ran parallel to Fort Fisher's sea face, ships passing through the inlet were given excellent protection. But not all attempts at running the blockade were successful. Some blockade runners were captured, and others in danger of capture were beached in an effort to salvage the cargo. Still, the successes far outnumbered the failures. By the fall of 1864, nearly 50 blockading vessels were in the Cape Fear vicinity, yet the port of Wilmington remained open. As early as the end of 1862, the Federals planned an attack on Fort Fisher and Wilmington, but the Federals found that the ironclads they had planned to use for the bombardment could not safely enter New Inlet for a rear attack, and the operation was called off. Fall 1864. The Federals again made plans to capture Fort Fisher. At that time, the land face of the fort was about 500 yards long and mounted 25 guns, which were protected by 32-foot mounds or traverses. The traverses rose 12 feet above the gun chambers and contained rooms used as powder magazines and bomb proofs. A series of broken passageways ran the length of the land face, and in the center was a heavily guarded entrance called the Sally Port. To discourage infantry assaults, a 9-foot palisades fence was constructed north of the fort from the river to the ocean. The sea face, which extended about 1,400 yards and mounted 22 guns, was made up of a series of connected batteries. Located at the end of the sea face was Mound Battery, which stood 60 feet in height and protected New Inlet. A half-mile to the southwest, on the tip of Federal Point, was Battery Buchanan, constructed in the summer of 1864. This impressive 4-gun battery overlooked New Inlet, the Cape Fear River, and the southern approaches to Fort Fisher. As a prelude to the opening shots of the First Battle of Fort Fisher, the Federals attempted one of the most bizarre experiments of the Civil War. On the night of December 23rd, the USS Louisiana, loaded with over 200 tons of powder, was positioned a few hundred yards from the fort and ready for detonation. The anticipated explosion was supposed to destroy part of the fort's earthworks and create such confusion among the Confederates that the fort could be occupied. But the blast, which came during the early morning hours of Christmas Eve, did little more than awaken everyone in the fort. In spite of the failure of the powder ship, Porter's fleet began to take up battle positions at daybreak, and by midday the bombardment had begun. Fort Fisher was severely outmanned and outgunned. The Federal fleet rained as many as 10,000 shells on the fort. The Confederates answered with only 672. Yet the fort's guns were not silenced. On Christmas morning, the Federals landed troops above Fort Fisher, and by the afternoon they had advanced to within 50 yards of the land face. But after surveying the situation, Generals Butler and Weitzel believed the fort could not be taken without a general siege. Since they were unprepared for a siege, the Federals evacuated all but 700 troops that night. Those remaining on the beach were withdrawn 2 days later, and the Union fleet steamed away. The Confederates were elated, but their elation was short-lived. 2 weeks later, the fleet returned, this time not to be denied a victory. With an armada of 58 warships and 19 transporters and landing barges, the Federals unleashed the most ambitious land-sea battle of the Civil War. The bombardment began on January 13th, and the same day, 8,000 troops were landed north of the fort. By noon January 15th, another 2,000 sailors and Marines had landed. The Confederates, with fewer than 2,000 men, put up a gallant fight, but were finally overcome. Fort Fisher, the Gibraltar of America, the Malakoff Tower of the South, had fallen. With the collapse of Fort Fisher, blockade running into the Cape Fear River ceased, and the fate of Wilmington was sealed. The South's last major port of entry had been eliminated, and the days of the Confederacy were numbered.
Much of the sea face of Fort Fisher now lies underwater, along with the artifacts of numerous shipwrecks related to the Civil War, which are routinely examined by the North Carolina Underwater Archaeology Lab, located here on property. Brunswick Town, on the west side of the Cape Fear River, contains similar mounds from Fort Anderson. Also open to the public as part of more than 20 North Carolina state historic sites. Please ask our staff about tours and events, and visit the Fort Fisher website for updates.
Fort Fisher is North Carolina's most important Civil War battlefield and her first National Historic Landmark. Fort Fisher was the largest joint Army, Navy, Marine bombardment and assault in U.S. history up until the Second World War. You're standing on hallowed ground. In fact, troops killed in the battle were originally buried where the museum is located today. They were later moved to Wilmington's National and Oakdale cemeteries. Fort Fisher led directly to the closing of the Fort of Wilmington, and the end of the Civil War followed within 90 days. Today, Fort Fisher State Historic Site is the most visited historic site in North Carolina, with over 600,000 visitors annually. The Friends of Fort Fisher ask for your support to make Fort Fisher and her story one that is known to all Americans. Please join the Friends today, or make a generous tax-deductible contribution to make sure that our programs, tours, and exhibits are available for all Americans.